Well, to discuss this story and other issues of the day, let's bring in our political panel now. From Melbourne, I'm joined by Liberal MP Tim Wilson. And from the top end, our Darwin studio, Labor's Luke Gosling. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Luke Gosling, as the only Special Forces or former Special Forces soldier on this panel, I'm going to start with you to ask you about this funding injection today. We talk of our Special Forces soldiers sort of being the very best, but as they stand, do you think that they're on par with our allies like the Navy SEALs?
Yeah, they're absolutely on par with our allies or anyone else in the world, but they need the best possible kit to do their job, and that's why we all welcome this announcement. I hope 500 million over the next, over the forward estimates is enough, but they should be allocated the funds that they need to make sure that they've got every possible advantage when defending Australia and our interests.
As I mentioned in the introduction there, we've spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past few decades. Obviously, we're looking at increasing strategic competition even in our own region. But what are the kinds of new operations that we need to be equipping our elite combat forces for?
A whole range of operations. Technology is moving so fast that anyone out there that would seek to do us harm or harm our national interests, you can bet they're going to have the best that money can buy in terms of technology. So whether it be unmanned assets that are going to assist them in target acquisition or intelligence gathering, whether it's going to be the best weaponry to make sure that our men and women get the best shot off. We need to make sure that our people have got the best. And the technology is increasing at a rapid pace. So the funding's welcome. Let's just get them the kit that they need as soon as possible.
Tim Wilson, do you think this is an acknowledgement that we're in kind of a new era of strategic competition, particularly in our own region?
I wouldn't say that anything's dramatically changed. I think the objective of the government is to make sure that we meet the expectations Australians have of us, which is to deliver a defence force that is 21st century capable, that is able to defend Australia, and yes, if necessary, to engage in competition in our region and of course across the globe. And Luke's right, by the way, the technology of other countries is evolving. Ours has to evolve and adapt to it. We're seeing increasing amount of different type of weaponry and different methods to be able to engage across the world, and the technology has to adapt and reflect that. And that's the approach the government's taking in investing $500 million as part of a much bigger package over 20 years of $3 billion of upgrades as part of an overall defence suite and defence investment to make sure that Australia can be a strong nation in the world.
Could this be sort of paving the way, perhaps, Tim Wilson, for more deployments overseas for our elite combat forces?
Well, I don't think anybody wants more deployments across the region or the world, but we also have to be a strong nation. That's the best basis in which we can preserve peace and make sure that we don't have to deploy our forces across the world. And so, we're watching, obviously, developments in our region very closely. They'll continue to evolve over time, and as a nation, we always need to be prepared to take whatever action it is in our national interest as part of a safe and stable region.
Staying with this region and some of the emerging issues, your Liberal colleague Andrew Hastie has written an opinion piece warning that Australia is at risk of becoming complacent as China grows really ever stronger in the region. What did you make of his remarks? Do you agree with him?
Well, I've said consistently that I have a lot of sympathy with what Andrew wrote. I'm concerned about developments, but I'm also I've always gone into this conversation, not recently, always with my eyes wide open about what can evolve. I'll always defend the right of a backbencher to be able to stand up and exercise or speak their piece, particularly because we're not talking about esoteric discussions around government policy. These are serious issues around the security of our nation in a region, and Australians should expect people to speak up if they have those concerns.
Luke Gosling, do you think that Australia does have its eyes wide open at the moment in terms of its approach, its strategy towards China?
Yeah, I think some of us does, and I think some of us do. I think it's a good thing for us to have the discussion because no matter what area of society we're talking about, we need to have a clear-eyed approach to how we are seen in the region, how we project ourselves in the region, our engagement in the region. It's very important that we do that in a clear-eyed way. What we need to do, obviously, is get the balance right between good trading relationships, our security relationships to keep Australia safe. I think we can play a much more active role in the region. I don't think anyone now knows what the next couple of years could entail. So we do need to be looking at the way things are developing, but we need leadership. We need to be taking a much more active role in ensuring that the conditions in our region, in the Indo-Pacific in particular, are conducive to the security of Australia, but also to the prosperity of Australia and us maintaining our great trading and alliance relationships.
When you say Australia needs to be playing a more active role, what do you mean? What would some examples of that be?
I mean, having a disciplined and constructive role to play in the challenges that we as a globe and we as a region face into the future. Now, the rules-based order that has meant that Australia has had great advances and decades of continuous economic growth. That rules-based order is experiencing some challenges. And what we need to make sure is that we're playing a front-footed and constructive role in making sure that that parties in our region, and obviously China, the United States being two big players in our region, are understanding each other, are working cooperatively, are respecting international laws and norms so that we can continue to keep Australia safe, but keep Australia prosperous and keep our region safe and secure.
Would you like to see Australia taking perhaps a more assertive approach towards China when it comes to standing up for our own national interest?
We should always stand up for Australia's national interests. Then there's no excuse for us not doing so. That is the one thing that we're paid to do, is to defend Australia and our interests. The way in which we do that, particularly in these times of great change and some tensions, is that we need leadership. And I think we need to see from the Prime Minister a lot more sure-footedness as we go about making sure that we are understood in the region and that there are the conditions that will enable us to continue to be secure and to be prosperous.
Tim Wilson, what do you make of those remarks? Do you think that the Prime Minister is showing adequate leadership on this incredibly tricky area? He said that the government's message on China has been clear and consistent, but has it?
Well, I have to say I think those comments by Luke are actually quite disappointing. In his remarks. I think Anthony Albanese has been disappointing in their remarks, because the reality is this is a space which is not straightforward. It has never been without complexity, and every time we've seen this Prime Minister and this government stand up for Australia's national interest against a very difficult global backdrop. We've seen, obviously, the retreat and the re-engagement of the United States. We've been working very explicitly with our trading partners and other defence allies, countries like Japan and Singapore and others, and are continuing to do so. So the deliberate partisan slant of some of these remarks is unhelpful. I'm not going to make the same sort of partisan remarks in return. I'd simply call on Luke and Anthony Albanese and others to step up to the plate, to expect and to live up to the responsibility that we all hold, and as he just voiced, which is to stand up for Australia's national interests and to work collaboratively together. And that's the approach the Prime Minister and this government has taken, and I would hope that they would do the same.
We've seen some pretty strong, well, I don't know if you call it condemnation, perhaps some criticism of Andrew Hastie's remarks by some senior cabinet ministers, Matthias Cormann, Simon Birmingham, just to name a few. They are making the point very clearly that this is a complex area, so don't add to that complexity. Is that the right kind of message for senior members to be making to backbenchers? Isn't that your right as a backbencher to speak freely on matters of your choosing?
Well, this is the explicit difference between a member of parliament and a member of the government. The government speaks on behalf of the nation. A member of parliament has every right to express their view, privately or publicly, on matters that affect the country, around from national security to areas around domestic public policy or even economic matters. And so, of course, backbenchers have that right and have the right to exercise it. Of course, the government has a right to respond, but our job as members of parliament is to hold the government to account, no matter which side we're on, and to raise those issues as is appropriate.
Do you think we're so worried about China's pretty predictable response to this kind of criticism? They are, of course, an incredibly important trading partner, but are we so worried about that that it sort of prevents us from having a mature foreign policy debate in Australia?
I don't think so. I think we can have a mature foreign policy debate. I think the challenge with our relationship with China as part of a region is that it's not a binary conversation. This isn't the United States versus China. It's not Australia versus China. It's not Australia plus the United States. There are a lot of other countries in our region that we work with, and I've listed some of them already. Of course, we've got, and there are many more. I mean, one of our biggest neighbour, Indonesia, plays a critical part of this conversation as well. And so it's all of us working together and trying to find a way to build, as Luke mentioned before, an international norm and an international order that's stable, that's predictable, that offers the opportunity for stability and cooperation for everybody. Now, of course, if that's not achievable, then we need to work with those nations who want to achieve common objectives, that share our values, and seek to build as much stability as possible to make sure the power is shared appropriately in the region.
Well, Luke Gosling, I'm just turning to you and your territory, the Northern Territory. Your Labor colleague Nick Champion has weighed into the debate about that very controversial 99-year lease that China has over the Darwin port. You've said today in an opinion piece it was a short-sighted and dangerous decision to go ahead and lease that port to China. Well, do you agree then that it should be nationalised, taken back by the Australian government?
Well, as Tim's just said, backbenchers well within their rights to comment on such things. But look, let me be frank, the lease of the Darwin port for 99 years should not have happened. It's not in the national interest for that to occur. The CLP government up here in the Territory at the time, I think, was short-sighted. The reason I say it's dangerous is because we don't know what the geostrategic position of our region is going to be at the end of this year, let alone the end of 5 years' time or 10 years' time, let alone 99 years' time. When it comes to strategic infrastructure like Australia's northern port, it's obviously preferable that that sort of strategic infrastructure is in Australia's hands. But
should the lease be torn up?
No, but the Darwin port, as far as I know, is not for sale. Now, I think we need to be very careful here about our want and our need to be not seen as a sovereign risk for foreign investment. Now, if we take Landbridge, the Chinese company that has the lease of the Darwin port for 99 years, they have an excellent investment in a $200 million hotel in Darwin. That is a suitable foreign investment, a hotel which is not a strategic asset or a strategic piece of infrastructure that's important for the national interest. So it should not have happened, and I'm glad that the Foreign Investment Review Board rules around strategic infrastructure have now been changed to prevent something like that happening in the past. And we've seen cases where that national interest test has been used to stop investments from foreign countries that aren't in the national interest.
All right, well, we are rapidly running out of time, so Tim Wilson, I'll give you the last word on this. Was it a big mistake for the then Territory government to lease this port? Do you think it would have happened if it were in perhaps the current climate that we're in?
That's all speculative, and of course I wasn't around when that decision was made. I think the most important thing is that we have a sensible process going forward around other infrastructure, and the government's established a critical infrastructure centre to assess things like these sales or these lease arrangements to make sure they're stack up then in the national interest and we're protecting Australia's sovereign interest, and that's the approach we're taking into the future. And of course, if there were a situation where it arose where we needed to take back control of any piece of infrastructure in the national interest, we have the capacity and the right to do so under the Constitution. We just have to compensate the owner for it, and I'm sure should that situation arise, we would.
All right, Tim Wilson, Luke Gosling, thank you for joining us today.